Hello everyone. Today we're going to be working on texture. So texture is an interesting aspect of art making, and as we've been going through our demos, we've been exploring different little elements that we can bring into a completed work of art. So with this drawing, I know that it's sometimes really a bit difficult to figure out the best way to produce something that might be more of an abstracted composition. So we're going to play around with this idea of the rule of thirds. So I'll explain that first as we get started, and then after that, we'll start to gather some really interesting texture materials, and there's obviously good and bad ways to gather those materials and see which ones might work best for a drawing. And then once we have some fascinating things to work with, we'll explore how we can try out collaging in actual texture into our drawings, printing texture as kind of a rubbing, and also see how we can create an illusion of texture by actually physically drawing that texture that we see in front of us. So I'm excited today, so let's get started. Okay, so why don't we take a little walk and see what kind of textures we can find around in our environment. Inside, outside, let's find something cool, okay? Textures are really just everywhere. Some of them contain pattern, some of them do not. Some of them are just pattern within themselves. Look around, see what you can find around you, and then maybe even head outside. And then outside, especially in the fall, you've got these amazing leaves that are wonderful to work with. You've got grass, sticks, wood textures, all sorts of things you can work with, and even little puppy dogs. Ha! Here are a few textured items that I found around the house and outside. A few tips. Don't draw from a photo reference. To really get the most out of this exercise, choose objects that you can see and touch in real life. Also, don't confuse pattern with texture. This ceramic pitcher has an interesting pattern, for example, but it remains flat on the surface of the object, as do other fabric patterns. Be sure to touch each object that you select. Can you feel the texture? So now it's time to lay out our textured materials that we wish to work with, and then get started. Here's an overview of some of the items that I'm thinking about working with. I have the rice paper there because I want to make some actual rubbed textures, and I thought perhaps that finer, kind of thinner paper would help to get the rubbing to come across a little bit more nicely for me. Although we will try it also with regular drawing paper so you can see how that looks. And then there are a few textures that I thought I could actually adhere to the paper, perhaps a mask, a leaf, some sandpaper. So I wanted to choose elements that aren't too three-dimensional, something that's going to be flatter so that my drawing doesn't look too strange with foreign elements on it. I want everything to be well integrated. And then I have the materials I'm going to be drawing with. Mostly we have charcoal, Conte, and white. And then when I do sort of simulated or drawn texture, I can also, go to my regular sort of drawing tools, decide if I want to use like pens or pencils. So let's see how the piece develops. I've also got my large 18 by 24 inch paper. So I'm going to tear one of these sheets out and start dividing it up into my sections for my organization of the drawing with the rule of thirds. Be sure to tear the fringe off the top of the paper before you begin drawing. The rule of thirds works by dividing the picture plane, aka your paper, into 3 equal sections both horizontally and vertically to form 9 equal sections, as you see me doing here. The rule of thirds is a great tool for composition. Whatever your subject matter, you'll be able to improve your art and design. So this rule states that if you divide any composition into thirds, vertically and horizontally, then place the key elements of your image either along these lines or at junctions of them, you'll achieve a more pleasing arrangement and more interesting and dynamic compositions. Artists use the rule of thirds for landscapes, still lifes, figures, and even portraits. However, for us, with this drawing that we're making today, we're going to see how it might work in an interesting way with abstract textures. So the rule of thirds gives you a guide for, placing focal points. The focal point of an artwork is the area of the composition to which the viewer's eye is naturally drawn. So if you design your focal points according to the intersections of any of the 9 rectangles, your picture will have the counterbalance needed to make the composition more interesting, a little bit more compelling. You can also design other elements in the picture to lead the eye from one of the focal points to the other, and using the corners to bring the viewer into the picture or keep the eyes moving back and forth into the picture again. So this kind of eye flow adds movement and life to a composition. So here the main faces sit on key intersections. So this painting shows how the main characters are all placed on the upper dividing line, creating a dynamic arrangement of figures. The rule of thirds is known as a tool for composing landscapes. In this painting, the horizon is placed in the lower thirds and the large mass of mountains and scenery is placed in the left section to create a more dynamic scene. The main function of the rule of thirds is to help create asymmetric compositions. Symmetrical balance occurs when you have 2 identical sides of a design with a central point of axis. So if you cut the design in half, the left and the right are mirror images of each other. To be considered perfectly symmetrical, a design needs to have equally weighted visuals on either side. Asymmetrical balance, on the other hand, as we are discussing, occurs when you have different visual elements on either side of the design, and yet the image still seems balanced. To be considered asymmetrical, a design needs to have unequal visual weight on either side, but those unequal visuals need to balance each other. So if the elements in a picture are centered and too balanced, it can become a little bit boring. So if the images are offset using the rule of thirds, the asymmetry and counterbalance of elements creates a more dynamic picture. So use the rule of thirds to create asymmetry without chaos. You can use the rule of thirds to help, place focal points as well as to guide the eye flow of your viewers. So in this painting by Rubens, for example, the main focal point of the boar is placed at an intersection. Secondary points of interest fall on intersections, as well as the action of the poses lead the eye from one focal point or intersection to another. By following the guidelines and intersections created by the rule of thirds, you can more easily create compositions that are asymmetric and dynamic. It can also help you to organize a more abstracted work. I often find that students have difficulty with abstraction, so let's see what we can do to try this rule to help us out. Before I begin building this drawing, I'm going to try out some of what you might call a printed texture, where I place a sheet of paper over the actual surface of an object and rub it across with my drawing tool in order to make an impression. I did this with some thinner rice paper that I had around, as well as directly onto my sheet of drawing paper. As you can see, this works well with objects that have a harder or more distinct ingrained texture. Another fancier art term for rubbing is frottage. This is a French term from the word frotter, which means to rub. It is a surrealist and automatic method of creating production developed by Max Ernst in 1925. Ernst was actually inspired by an ancient wooden floor where the grain of the planks, had been accentuated by many years of scrubbing. The patterns of the grain, were suggesting strange images to him. He captured these by laying sheets of paper on the floor and then rubbing over them with a soft pencil. So hopefully, this process inspires you a little bit. Your immediate surroundings offer a multitude of possibilities for this process. You can play around with what objects work best for your tools, and you can change the effect by modifying the pencil pressure on the sheet of paper. Actually, when I travel, I often take rubbings on site in interesting locations, mainly in my sketchbook, but also as inspiration for later drawings. The floors of a cathedral or tiles of a wall can create some beautiful impressions, as well as an impression of your experience of travel. Okay, so as I am, starting to, think about how this drawing is going to come together, I've got my different rubbings. I have you know, maybe a couple of actual textures I could collage into the space. And then I want to think about how I'm going to arrange the things that I draw as well. So, you know, as I do this, you know, I've got my scissors handy or an X-Acto knife. You know, I don't want these to be like boring. I want this to be like a nice, active, dynamic space. So I can cut out shapes rather than letting these sort of rice paper rubbings be rectangular. So it doesn't look like I've just slapped things on there. And then I kind of like, you know, the comparison of where this actually got a little bit of a rip in it because the paper is so fine. But I'm thinking that I could maybe overlay it with this other one that I did on the stronger drawing paper and see what it might look like with one on top of the other, because this paper is somewhat transparent as well. And you can see that I've also, you see there, I've also taped down my drawing paper because I'm going to be adding some matte medium, which I use as a glue, to glue these different elements down once I've got them sort of arranged how I would like, and figuring out the placement, and, you know, thinking about the rule of thirds and what I'm placing at those intersections. So I'll take some time to see what I can do and come up with a little bit of a plan for this. I have now gathered all of my textures here to begin arranging my drawing along the lines of the rule of thirds to help me with my compositional strategies for this abstract drawing. You know, I'm using different types of textures as well to create a variety of effects with this piece. So first you see, you know, actual texture. This is known as tactile texture, which is the tactile quality of a surface, with, you know, like rough, smooth, sticky, fuzzy, soft, or slick. A real texture is one you can actually feel with your hand, such as a piece of sandpaper, a wet glass, or animal fur. It can also be created by the artist by doing a kind of collage element. So here in my drawing, you can see I'm using real sandpaper, a leaf, and a mask as tactile textures in the piece. So the separate rubbed textures on rice paper have the potential to become actual texture as well, if I chose to like crumple up that paper, for instance. However, I'm going to use it as collage here in the drawing. So collage is another French term, but one that you're probably more familiar with than frottage. The term collage derives from the French coller, meaning glue. It is a form of art in which various materials such as photographs and pieces of paper or fabric are arranged and glued together on a surface like paper. So when I collage into a work, I use matte medium. I actually buy a good bit of matte medium because I can use it in so many different ways. You know, it works well to create an image transfer, as an acrylic painting medium to make, you know, the paint transparent, and as an acid-free kind of glue to collage elements into a drawing. So when you use matte medium to collage, just be sure, you know, the medium to brush it across the entire back of the collage element and adhere it well to the surface of your paper. So you can see that I have taped down my drawing paper because, you know, anytime you use paint or other wet media, you know, the paper will bubble up, and as it dries, it will flatten out again. So if you've taped it down properly, it'll be nice and flat for you. So I press the collage element down onto the paper, and then also I will often brush the medium over the top of the collage element to, you know, protect that element and to allow me to, you know, paint and draw further on top of that element. So with the tactile texture elements, I use matte medium as well, and then set a few heavy books on top in order to be sure that those elements adhere very well as also. So the goal for this drawing really is to use all these different ways of creating texture, but also to integrate them to create a nice, complete drawing that has a harmonious feel to it, you know, even though it has a lot of activity and variety. So, you know, you want them to look very interesting together and make them look like they're well situated within the work. So you can now see me moving on to developing another type of texture, which is hand-drawn texture, also known as simulated or visual texture. So visual texture is the visual quality of the surface. It is the result from painting or drawing as, from the real texture as you see it. Visual texture is an illusion of texture created by the artist. So drawing tools can be manipulated to give the impression of texture while the surface of the paper itself remains smooth and flat. So here we go with yet another French term related to this process. This one is trompe-l'oeil, which means to fool the eye. So it is an art technique that creates optical illusions so the painted or drawn objects appear in 3 dimensions. So whether it's a painted fly that we're tempted to brush away or an illusionistic piece of paper that's curling at the edges that kind of entices us to pick it up, trompe-l'oeil makes us question the boundary between the painted or drawn world and ours. So the earliest account of trompe-l'oeil comes from ancient Greece, actually, where a contest took place between 2 prominent artists called Zeuxis and Parrhasius. So it's an interesting story, and it goes that Zeuxis painted grapes with such skill that birds flew down to peck at them. And not wanting to be outdone, Parrhasius painted an illusionistic curtain that fooled even the discerning eye of his fellow painter, who tried to draw it to one side. So this famous anecdote was repeated in later art treatises and also encouraged artists to emulate their classical predecessors. As I am continuing with the drawing, I'm using these, hand-drawn textures to help pull together all the variations of textures that I've built into this drawing. So you saw me draw, the illusion of the leaf texture there, while next to it is a collaged in rubbed texture of a leaf, and next to that is the actual leaf itself. So this is a really great comparison of the visual effects of each of these processes, and a lot of fun to play around with. So I'm adding in additional drawing textures with a combination of charcoal, conte, and graphite, and thinking carefully about the flow of the various elements across the page. So abstracted works are often, built by the artist in a more intuitive manner, and so you might find that you enjoy this process of developing the composition of the work as you see the various parts needing attention in different ways. as I completed the drawing, I added in some smaller accents with the pen and took an overall look at the work to bring it to completion. So today we learned, a good bit of French, actually, some history, and came up with a great strategy for creating a dynamic and abstracted work using the rule of thirds. Really nice, I really love the results. Okay, so that's a wrap for today with our nice textured sort of abstraction that we produced with the rule of thirds. It's been a lot of fun, and as you can see, with abstracted work, you tend to be a little bit more experimental, see how things go, and push and pull different things and make a lovely, fun mess. So, hopefully, you'll join me next time, and perhaps my little puppy down here, if she'll come out. There she is. Okay, it's been fun working with you, and don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.